The town of Crestfall, Colorado, was built on mud and hope. In spring, the single street was a river of thick, brown sludge that sucked at wagon wheels and the hems of ladies' skirts. In summer, it was a haze of fine, choking dust. But always, framing the hard-scrabbled timber buildings, were the mountains. They stood indifferent to the seasons, their peaks scraped against a sky so blue it ached. They were a promise and a threat, a constant reminder of how small a man's concerns were. Clara Voss understood the language of the mountains. It was a language of patience, of endurance. It was the same language her life had spoken for the last 6 years, since she had buried her mother and then her father, and was left with a small, sturdy house on the edge of town and a quietness that had settled into her bones. At 26, she was an island of self-sufficiency in a community that prized the same. She kept a garden, put up her own preserves, and her needlework was the neatest in the county. She did not complain. She did not ask for help. She endured, like the mountains. And every Sunday, for 2 years, she baked cinnamon rolls. The ritual was its own form of quiet language. Saturday evening, she would mix the dough, the familiar work of her hands a comfort in the dim lamplight. The scent of yeast and sugar was a small rebellion against the sterile quiet of her house. She would let it rise overnight, a slow, hopeful swelling in the darkness. Before the sun had even thought to touch the peaks of the mountains, she would be awake, rolling out the dough, sprinkling it with the precious mixture of cinnamon and brown sugar, a scent that was memory and comfort all at once. The rolls were for Eli Harmon. His ranch bordered the back of her property, a sprawling expanse of land that ran right up to the foothills. He was a man carved from the same material as the mountains, solid, quiet, enduring. 2 years ago, his wife, Mary, had been taken by a fever that swept through the valley, leaving Eli a widower at 30, with a house full of memories and a silence far louder than Clara's own. The first Sunday after the funeral, Clara had found herself at his door, a basket covered with a linen cloth in her hands, the warmth of the rolls radiating through the fabric. She had not known what to say, so she had said nothing, just offered the basket. He had taken it with a nod, his eyes hollowed out by a grief too vast to name. And so it began, a wordless tradition, a gesture of care that asked for nothing in return. She told herself it was simple kindness, the sort of thing any good neighbor would do. She told the town, when asked, even less. It was just rolls. Eli Harmon was a man of routine. He rose with the sun, worked until his muscles burned with a satisfying ache, and fell into bed too tired for dreams. For 2 years, work had been his only solace. The branding, the mending of fences, the long cattle drives, they were a bulwark against the tide of memory that threatened to pull him under in the quiet moments. His house, once filled with Mary's laughter and the scent of her baking, was now just a place to shelter from the weather. He kept it clean, with the joyless order of a man maintaining a property rather than living in a home. The pantry was stocked with tins and dried beans. The dishes were always washed and put away. The second rocking chair by the hearth, the one Mary had loved, was pushed tight against the wall, a silent, dusty monument. He had spent 2 years keeping his grief at arm's length, a dangerous animal he did not dare engage with. And every Sunday, Clara Voss appeared on his porch with warm cinnamon rolls. He had come to anticipate the faint scent of cinnamon on the morning air, the soft knock, the brief, quiet exchange. It was a single point of light in a week of gray routine. He would take the basket, murmur his thanks, and watch her walk back across the field, her posture straight, her steps measured. He noticed the way the sun caught the blonde strands in her hair, the steadfast set of her shoulders. He noticed, but he did not allow himself to think on what he noticed. It felt like a betrayal. This Sunday was different. The air was sharp, carrying the first real bite of autumn. He had watched from his window as she crossed the field, the familiar basket in her hand, a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He saw her, and a feeling that was not grief, not work, not exhaustion stirred in his chest. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself in a long, long time. It was want. He opened the door before she knocked. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with a flicker of surprise. She held out the basket. "Good morning, Eli." The scent of cinnamon and warm bread washed over him. It smelled of home. It smelled of life. He looked from the basket to her face, a face that had become as much a part of his Sundays as the rising sun. He could not take the rolls today. He could not take them and close the door and eat them alone in the sterile silence of his kitchen. It was suddenly, profoundly unbearable. His own voice sounded rough to his ears, unused to forming such a request. "I'll take them," he said, and then he paused, the words catching in his throat. He cleared it. "I'll take them, Clara, only if you'll come in and share them with me." A pause. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves around the porch steps. Clara's expression did not change, but he saw the small, almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers on the basket handle. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. He knew that. She was a woman who waited, who observed. He had seen her do it for 2 years. She looked from his face to the open door behind him, into the dim, quiet hall of his house. He knew what she would see. A house kept, not lived in. A house waiting. He wondered if she could hear the echo of the silence. "All right, Eli," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I can do that." He stepped back, holding the door wider, and for the first time in 2 years, Clara Voss stepped inside Eli Harmon's house. The air inside was cool and still. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather and loneliness. Everything was neat, terribly neat. The floors were swept clean, the furniture was free of dust, but there was no life. No stray book left open, no shawl draped over a chair, no sign that a person moved and breathed and existed within these walls beyond the bare necessities. He led her to the kitchen. It was a large, well-made room with a sturdy table in the center. He took the basket from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. A jolt, small and quiet, passed between them. He set the basket on the table and turned to the stove. "Coffee? Please." She sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She watched him move. He was a man of solid, efficient grace. He ground the beans, his movements economical, measured. There was a strength in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands, calloused and capable, handled the delicate task of making coffee. She had watched him from a distance for years, mending fences, riding his land, but seeing him here, in his own kitchen, was different. It was intimate. He brought 2 mugs to the table and a small pitcher of cream. He uncovered the rolls, and the warm, sweet scent filled the room, a stark contrast to the cool sterility. He placed one on a plate for her, and one for himself. The silence settled between them, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they shared on the porch. This one was heavier, filled with unspoken things. She took a bite of her roll. It was good. She knew it was good. But eating it here, across from him, felt momentous. She looked around the kitchen again, and her gaze fell on the far wall. Against it, 2 straight-back dining chairs were pushed flush, as if in punishment. One of them should have been at this table. One of them was Mary's chair. Clara knew it without asking. A pang of sadness, sharp and sudden, went through her, for the woman she had barely known, and for the man sitting across from her, living in a house full of ghosts. He saw her looking. He followed her gaze to the chairs, and a shadow passed over his face. He said nothing. He just took a sip of his coffee. She brought her eyes back to him. She would not mention the chairs. She would not mention the stark neatness of the pantry she could see through the open door. She would not mention the palpable absence that was the loudest thing in the room. Instead, she asked, How is the new fence line holding up by the creek? And just like that, the tension eased. A small, grateful light entered his eyes. He began to talk about the fence, about the stubbornness of a particular bull, about the threat of an early winter. She listened, asking questions now and then, about his herd, about the price of feed. They talked of practical things, of work, of the weather. They talked of everything except the 2 chairs against the wall and the fact that this was the first time in 2 years he had shared a meal with a woman at this table. When the rolls were gone and the coffee was drunk, she stood. "Thank you for the coffee, Eli. It was very good." "Thank you for the rolls, Clara," he said, walking her to the door. "As always." She stepped out onto the porch, into the bright, crisp morning. She turned to look at him. "Next Sunday?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. He gave a slow nod, a small, almost smile touching his lips. Next Sunday. And so the new ritual began. Every Sunday she would arrive with the rolls, and he would have the coffee ready. She would step inside, and they would sit at his kitchen table and talk. The awkwardness of that first breakfast slowly melted away, replaced by a comfortable, shared quiet. The silence was no longer heavy with things unsaid. It was a space they could both rest in. She learned the rhythms of his life through their conversations. She learned he preferred his coffee black, that he had a dry, understated wit that took her by surprise, that he worried about a particular calf with a weak leg. He learned that she had a fierce opinion on the proper way to stake tomato plants, that she had read every book in the small church library twice, and that her quietness was not shyness, but a deep, thoughtful stillness. One Sunday, she found him on his porch, whittling a piece of wood. He was fixing the handle on one of her garden trowels. The blade had come loose the week before, a fact she had mentioned in passing. She had not asked him to fix it. "I noticed it was wobbly," he said, not looking up from his work. He handed it to her. The new handle was smooth and fit her hand perfectly. It was a simple, unspoken gesture, an act of care. She took it. "Thank you, Eli. It's perfect." "Just practical," he mumbled, but he looked pleased. The next week, she brought a jar of her best strawberry preserves along with the rolls. He was changing. She saw it in small ways. He started leaving a book on the table by the hearth. A stray piece of harness leather might be left on a workbench. The house was slowly beginning to look lived in again. But the second chair remained against the wall, a silent sentinel. She never mentioned it. She simply kept coming back. Eli found himself looking forward to Sundays in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Clara's presence in his kitchen was like rain after a long drought. She brought color and warmth and the scent of cinnamon into the gray landscape of his life. He found himself thinking of things to tell her during the week, a funny thing a calf did, a passage he'd read in the newspaper. He was re-engaging with the world, not just enduring it. He started noticing things, not just about her, but about himself. He noticed the way he automatically set 2 places at the table on Sunday morning. He noticed the sound of her laugh, a low, warm chuckle, was a sound he wanted to hear more often. He noticed that the silence after she left on Sunday afternoon was heavier than all the silence of the week combined. He had loved Mary with the fierce, unthinking certainty of youth. Their life together had been a given, a solid foundation he had built his world upon. When she died, the foundation had crumbled, and he had been adrift ever since. The thought of loving again felt like a betrayal not just to Mary's memory, but to the man he had been with her. How could he want this quiet, steady woman in his kitchen when Mary was lying in the cold ground on the hill? Grief, he was learning, was a jealous master. But Clara was not a replacement. She was different. Where Mary had been bright laughter and bustling energy, Clara was quiet strength and watchful calm. Being with her did not erase Mary. It did not diminish what they had. It was something new, something he was afraid to name. He knew, on some level, that he had noticed Clara long before the roles gave him an excuse. He had seen her in town, a solitary, graceful figure. He had seen her tending her garden, her movements efficient and strong. He had seen the quiet dignity with which she carried her own losses. He had been drawn to her strength, her self-possession. A woman of substance. Mary would have liked her. The thought came to him unbidden one day, and it was not painful. It was just true. The catalyst came in the form of Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy was the manager of the bank in Crestfall. He was a man of considerable standing, with a fine house, a polished buggy, and a wardrobe of suits that were never dusty. He was a good man, honorable and well regarded, and for several months he had been making his intentions toward Clara Voss quite clear. Eli saw it first from a distance. Abernathy's buggy parked in front of Clara's house on a Tuesday afternoon, then a Thursday. He saw them walking together after church, Clara's posture as straight and dignified as ever, Abernathy at her side, leaning in to speak to her. The town noticed, of course. The Greek chorus of shopkeepers and neighboring wives saw the match as a good one. She needs a man to look after her, one might say at Gable's Mercantile. And he needs a wife to make that big house a home. Eli heard the talk. Every word was a stone in his gut. He told himself it was no business of his. Clara was a free woman. Abernathy was a good man. It was a sensible match. But the thought of Abernathy sitting in Clara's neat parlor, of his polished buggy being a permanent fixture at her gate, filled Eli with a feeling so raw and possessive it shook him. One Saturday, he was in Gable's, buying a sack of grain. Mr. Gable, a man who had seen Crestfall grow from a handful of cabins, was weighing out the oats. "Looks like we might be having a wedding soon," Gable said, not looking at Eli, his focus entirely on the scales. Eli grunted, non-committal. "Mr. Abernathy is a fine man," Gable continued, his voice casual. "Good head for business. Steady. And Miss Voss? Well, the town looks out for her. Be good to see her settled." He finally looked up, his gaze sharp and direct. He met Eli's eyes. "A man can be too slow for his own good, Eli. Sometimes a thing needs to be claimed before it's gone." Gable finished tying the sack and hefted it onto the counter. "You have a remarkable inability to see what's standing right in front of you," he said, his tone not unkind. "Just factual. Both, I expect." The words hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. He paid for the grain, loaded it into his wagon, and drove home in a daze. Gable's words echoed in his head, stripping away the careful layers of denial he had wrapped around himself. He was being slow. He was being a fool. He had been so consumed by the grief of what he had lost that he was about to lose the first thing he had wanted in 2 years. The thought of a Sunday without Clara in his kitchen, without her quiet presence across the table, was a bleak and barren prospect. The thought of her sitting at Abernathy's table, in Abernathy's house, that was a future he could not stomach. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark by his cold hearth, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He thought of Mary, of their life together, of the love he still carried for her. And he realized, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that loving Mary and wanting Clara were not mutually exclusive. His heart was not a finite space. Grief had made its own rules, yes, but he had followed them long enough. Grief did not have to be a life sentence of solitude. It could be a scar, a part of him, a testament to a love that was real and true. But a scar did not mean you could not live again. He finally understood. He was not betraying Mary by wanting a future. He was honoring the life they had built by choosing to live again. The next morning, he was waiting on the porch when he saw her coming across the field. The sun was just rising, painting the mountains in hues of pink and gold. She carried the basket as always, a small, steadfast figure against the vast landscape. His heart hammered in his chest. She reached the bottom step of his porch and looked up at him. She saw the sleeplessness in his eyes, the tension in his jaw. She stopped. "Eli, is everything all right?" "Clara," he said, his voice husky. He came down the steps to stand in front of her, blocking her path. He looked at the basket in her hands, the offering she had so faithfully brought him for 2 years. "I need to say something." He took a deep breath. The words came out plain and unadorned, the only way he knew. "I've been a slow and foolish man. I've been so afraid of dishonoring what I lost that I didn't see what I was being given." Her eyes, wide and searching, stayed on his. "I noticed you," he went on, the words gaining momentum. "I noticed you long before the roles, Clara. I saw you in town, in your garden. I saw your strength, and I was afraid of it. I was afraid of what it made me feel." He reached out, not to take the basket, but to take her hand. Her fingers were warm in his cold ones. "These Sundays, they've been the only thing that's felt real in 2 years. I don't want them to be because of Mr. Abernathy or because the town thinks you need settling. I want them to be because of us." A tear welled and slipped down her cheek, but she did not look away. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know this. The thought of this house without you is a quiet one. But the thought of the world without you in it, somewhere, for me, everywhere, is quiet then. The silence is everywhere." He swallowed, his gaze pleading. "Grief makes a man slow, and I have been so slow, but I am here now. Clara Voss, I am asking you to let me stay. Not just for breakfast. I am asking you to be my wife." She looked at him, at this solid, steady man whose heart had been locked away for so long. She saw the fear and the hope warring in his eyes. She saw the end of her own long wait. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "Grief makes its own rules, Eli," she said softly, her thumb stroking the back of his hand. "But no one agreed to keep them forever." She took a shaky breath. "It took you long enough." And then, with more certainty than she had felt about anything in her life, she added, "Yes. Obviously, yes." Their courtship was as practical and solid as they were. He ate supper at her table 3 nights a week, sitting in the chair her father used to occupy. She came to his ranch on Saturdays, and they worked side by side in the garden he had tilled for her beside his house. They talked of real things, of combining their properties, of the children they hoped to have, of the future they would build together. One afternoon, while they were mending a fence, he stopped, took her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but of deep, settled certainty. It tasted of sunshine and hard work and home. And one day, she walked into his kitchen to find him moving the second chair from its place against the wall and setting it at the table, right next to his own. They were married in the small-town church on a bright day in October. The whole of Crestfall was there. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress her mother had sewn, and in her hands she carried not a bouquet of flowers, but a single, perfect, late-blooming rose from her garden. Eli stood at the altar, his gaze never leaving her as she walked down the aisle. He looked like a man who had found his anchor in a storm. Mr. Gable beamed from a front pew. Mr. Abernathy sat near the back, looking pensive but resigned, and he nodded respectfully as they passed. It was a wedding that felt not like a beginning, but a continuation, a righting of things, a final, quiet settling. 6 years later, the evening sun cast long shadows across the porch. Eli sat in one of the rocking chairs, the wood worn smooth with time, mending a small leather strap for a bridle. The house behind him was no longer silent. It was filled with the clutter and noise of a life fully lived. Blankets were tossed over chairs, children's drawings were tacked to the wall, and the air smelled of baking bread and contentment. Clara came out with 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to him. She settled into the rocker beside him, the one that used to be Mary's, and for a long time now had just been hers. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching their 2 children play in the yard below. A boy of 5, with his father's steady eyes and a shock of blonde hair, was intently trying to build a tower of rocks. His sister, a year younger, with her mother's quiet smile and a tangle of dark curls, was directing him with solemn importance. "He has your patience," Clara said softly. Eli looked at his son, then at his wife. A slow smile spread across his face. "And she has your bossiness." Clara laughed, the warm, low sound that was now the constant music of his life. She leaned her head against the back of her chair, her gaze soft as she watched their children. "I was just thinking," she said, "about that first Sunday, in your kitchen." He stopped his work. The memory as clear for him as it was for her. "I was terrified," he admitted. "Thought you would say no and walk away." "Never," she said. "I would have waited." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. "I know," he said. "It's what I counted on." He looked at her, at the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and shared worries, at the quiet strength that had first drawn him and had anchored him ever since. "Still think I was too slow." "You got there, Eli," she said, squeezing his hand. "You got there." They watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors it had on the morning he had finally asked her to stay. The children's laughter floated up to them on the cooling air. It was a good life, a quiet life, built not on grand gestures or poetic declarations, but on the steady accumulation of small, ordinary moments. It was a love built on cinnamon rolls and mended fences, on shared silence and practical kindness. That is the thing about such love, the quiet kind. It does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives softly, like the first light of dawn, and you discover one day that it has become the very sun you orbit, the warmth that makes everything grow.